Welcome to our class. In this class, we will look at links, images, and timers. In the HTML language, there are several common default actions that occur in the web page. One is with the A element or the anchor tag. The other ones are with form elements. For example, if we click on an anchor, we will by default be taken to the value of the href attribute, which is generally another web page. If we click on the button type equals submit, it generally will call the action of the form and submit it. Type equals reset will also by default reset the elements to the initial values. There are times when we want to use these elements in the web page and program them with JavaScript. However, we do not want the default action to occur. So therefore, we need to cancel the default action. Whenever an event occurs, behind the scene, an event object is created. Events happen all the time. However, we want to use those events when we need to execute JavaScript. We have the prevent default method of the event object, which will prevent the default action from occurring. So let's review our anchor element. When we click on the text inside the opening and closing A tags, by default, we will be calling the href attribute and that page will load in the browser. Supposing we wanted to click on a link that has an image as the value of href. We may not necessarily want to load that image, but we might want to execute some JavaScript. How we would handle that is to use the prevent default method of the window object. So here is an example of how that code would work. We need to pass that function the event object, and that is represented by any variable we choose. And once we use that variable and add the prevent default method to it, we are executing that method on the event object. Therefore, we can execute the JavaScript code when we click that link, and the value of the href will have no bearing on our JavaScript code. JavaScript also enables us to access images as objects. In order to do that, we need to use the image object and create a new instance of that image, similar to what we would be doing with the date object. Once we do that, we can access various properties of that image, such as the source attribute, the alt attribute, the width, and the height. Therefore, we can change those values of those properties using JavaScript. Many JavaScript applications, such as image carousels or sliders, work with images. In order to ensure a smooth transition between images, we want to preload those images into the browser cache before they are actually being used. This is a very common procedure that you will see in many JavaScript applications. There are several ways that we can do this. This is one example. Here we have a function called Preload Images that will execute when we call it when the page loads. You see, we first need to create the image object, and we are storing it in a variable. Now we are listing our images in an array. We are using that for loop to loop through the array, and what we are doing is we are assigning the actual image name to the source property of that array, and you can test that using an alert. These images are not being displayed on the web page. However, they are being preloaded into cache so that when we need to use them, they are already downloaded and available. Here is another example of preloading images. In this instance, the images already exist on the web page. Here we have an image being used as a hyperlink, and the href value of that hyperlink is a larger image. So when we click on the thumbnail, the larger image will appear underneath it. So let's take a look at how we preload that image. First of all, we have a collection of A elements that contain the image. Therefore, we can use getElementsByTagName and store all of those A elements in a variable called links, which essentially is an array. Therefore, we have a length property, and we can easily loop through that array. And every time we loop through that array, we are setting the source of that image to the value of the href of that link. Now, just to show you how we would display the larger image on the page from clicking the thumbnail, we would attach the onClick event handler to the image links array, and we would pass it the event object because we want to cancel that default action. And now we are assigning the variable link to the current instance being clicked on. The image at the bottom of the page has an ID, and therefore the source of that is the value from the href attribute. So that is how we change that image. And we are also changing the caption by using the title of that image and storing that in the element for the caption. We also can change the source of the image with the mouse over and mouse out event. This would only be applicable to larger images that are actually content. Should you wish to change the image on a navigation button, you would just use CSS and change the background image. So here we have two images in our page, and we have stored the reference in variables. On the first image, we are calling the mouse over event, which calls an anonymous function, and we very simply just change the source property to the new image. For that same image, we have another anonymous function being called for the mouse out event, where we simply change the source property of that image back to the original image. And this is a very easy way to accomplish a mouse over. In JavaScript, we also have timers. Timers that allow us to time out some code and allow us to set code at an interval. We have the set timeout function and the clear timeout function. What this allows us to do is to execute code at a specific time, which is set in milliseconds. There are 1,000 milliseconds in a second. We also can clear that timeout by passing the variable associated with that function. An example of when you might do that would be to close a message box after a certain number of seconds. A more common use of timers is working with intervals. We have the ability to execute code repeatedly at a specified interval. This is accomplished using the setInterval function, which takes the function to be executed and the number of milliseconds, and we can also clear out that interval. To clear out that interval, you would need to define a variable and pass it to that method. A common example for using an interval would be on a slideshow to have it repeat frequently, and a clock. So let's take a look at how we would use the setInterval method of the window object using a clock. Here in the onload section, I have the showtime function being called. This function works with the date object and also with the placeholder where we will output the value. And we are simply using the toLocalTimeString method of the date object to simply display the time. Inside that function, we call the setInterval method and pass it the name of the function and the value of 1,000. That means 1 second. So we see that this function is being executed, and at the end of the function, it calls itself again every second. So every second, you see a new time on your web page, which simulates the ticking of a clock.